Good morning. This is Christopher Meyer. I'm a domestic violence lawyer for the greater Houston area. I'm making this video after I had saw some concerning information in the local news about domestic violence, and it really got me to think about how the Houston area, I do not feel we have the same level of domestic violence infrastructure that you might see in other cities. And I also recently reviewed a study released by the University of Houston about the increase in domestic violence over the last 3 years since the COVID lockdown. Keep in mind, we went into quarantine back in March 2020, and now it's March 2023. It's been 3 years, a lot of time to collect a lot of data, and it was known for a long time that the quarantine and everything that happened with COVID would increase domestic violence. We knew that, but we finally have something on paper, which is good. But I do want to talk briefly an anecdotal story about a woman who had was almost killed by her ex-husband, and then I'm going to tie it into this report about how we're also looking at a much larger issue in the Houston area. So what had happened recently? A woman here in the greater Houston area was in an abusive relationship with her husband. The domestic violence led up to her getting a protective order, which he violated, and he came and beat her and also poured gasoline all over her. Fortunately, she survived, and he's in jail, charged with continuous family violence and violation of a protective order. I'm not going to mention any names or specific counties or cities, but I will tell you it is in the part of the greater Houston area. His wife is safer now because he's behind bars, which is good. She's had, I saw some of the pictures. She did have multiple bruises on her body that she suffered at the hands of her abusive husband. And it was not the first time that they had incidences of family violence. Now, the thing about domestic violence is it's really funny, and many times victims go back to their abusers. There's a lot of, I guess, codependency involved. And if you want to learn more about that, check out my podcast, on my YouTube podcast. I do have podcasts about codependency if you want to learn a little bit more about that. But she did feel bad. She felt bad for the abuser because there was a child involved, and he had nowhere else to go. He got kicked out. So she did let him back in, which kind of complicates the protective order. He's still not even, and the thing about the protective order was that the victim doesn't have the authority to tell the abuser that the protective order is no longer is vacated. That's not the victim's decision. That is the judge's decision. So even though she let him back in, he still, by him, even though there was an invitation to return to the home, it was still a violation. So he's still violating a court order. And if the victim truly wants the protective order to go away, she needs to get a lawyer it's called vacating the protective order. But that's a separate discussion. They did have a lot of arguments. There was one incident where they went to a bar, they got into an argument, and that's when he poured gasoline all over her and everything she owned. She was scared. Eyes were burning, couldn't even open her eyes. And I think this story is important because it's a cautionary tale of what can happen if the victim goes back to the abuser. So if you know somebody who's being abused, physically abused, it's important for you to be there for them, to support them, to encourage them, and also encourage them to stay away from the abuser and not return. Good news is think he's going to be behind bars for a while, and I hope this never happens again. But if he would have been successful, the victim would be 6 feet underground today, which is very scary. So I'm glad this woman is sharing her story with the community about the importance of not going back to the victim. Okay, so we covered the story. Now I want to talk about a report recently released by the University of Houston, and I'll share a link down in the article portion associated with this podcast video, and also down in the comments. But it's a report published by the University of Houston Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality. It's a report to the community on the domestic violence. I'm going to go ahead and screen share this with you. Bear with me. Okay, so here's a copy of the report. I'll try to zoom in where I can. It was published by Elizabeth Gregory, PhD, Zachary Hu, looks like Masters of Econ, and Itzel Martinez. So let's take a look at the overview. The network domestic violence DV services provided in the Houston region build and deliver a safety net for Houstonians and their children fleeing violence, underwritten by a mixture of philanthropic, federal, and state dollars, but they're underfunded relative to need and cannot meet demand for shelter or non-residential services, nor can they address the underlying causes of that demand. So basically, the underfunded and the infrastructure is lacking. The high volume of people experiencing domestic violence in this region links directly to the state's low level of family support infrastructure. So that's going to the Texas legislature. They need to step up. The lack of affordable housing and the low wages earned by Texas women. Okay, so there is much larger social issues here with income disparity and wealth gaps. People dependent on others, especially those with children, become more vulnerable to violence at the hands of those they depend on. So that's part of it. A lot of it has to do with resources, income, and acknowledging that the aggressor many times is also the provider in the relationship, which complicates things. And also one of the reasons why victims end up going back to the abuser, because the economy does not have the resources for them, and also the infrastructure is not there. And I haven't even got into the lack of beds available at these domestic violence shelters. So it really impacts people of low income. Higher income women might be able to leave when things get grim and still keep themselves and their children housed. They're less likely to utilize shelters than poor women. So the wealth gap is a factor. All right, recent intimate partner violence assault by the now former UT basketball coach and the January domestic violence cases involving a house set fire with the family inside and decapitation of a young immigrant bride indicate that violence is rampant across ranks. So UT basketball coach, much higher social class, and domestic violence transcends into that class. And then we have cases where looks like the immigrant community, there's abuse in the immigrant community, which is typically less well off. And also a domestic violence case involving a house set fire with the family inside. I don't have enough information about those victims' social class, but I think the point of this overview is to just show that it transcends social classes. Okay, I'm about to get into some really scary statistics here. It said the COVID emergency raised the level of domestic violence in the Houston area. We knew that, but we're finally starting to have the data here. And per HPD, Houston Police Department and Harris County Sheriff's Office data, so they got a lot of data from the Sheriff's Office and HPD. I know LexisNexis has really great crime maps where you can see where all the crimes are happening on a map, and it's all broken down by category. So kudos to our law enforcement for making that information so easily available. But looking at this data, it's been identified that intimate partner violence homicides have continued to rise after the lockdown ended. And in these, we're going to call them jurisdictions, like the Houston area, there was basically a threefold, it's jumped threefold over the last 3 years. A lot of it has to, a lot of incoming calls requesting shelter and safety planning assistance, and those phone calls just continue to rise. Phone calls to police departments have always been high. While this data indicate that the problem is serious, they do not account for the full experience of domestic violence in the region. Since many individuals affected by violence don't call, doubting there's a better alternative available long term, and this is hinted at by the high proportion of domestic violence homicide victims who have no record of contacting a shelter previous to their demise, suggesting that those who do reach out may access resources that help them evade such outcomes. Okay, so let me kind of jump down to the ask. Though Houston domestic violence services providers were already strapped before the pandemic, but since its onset, in the face of multiplying demand, they have stepped up services, helped by COVID emergency federal funds. But before those funds are gone, the community can prepare for the long haul by strengthening its domestic violence infrastructure. So it looks like the COVID relief funds are coming to an end, and a lot of those funds were set aside to help with domestic violence. But with some of the federal funding going away, we expect the problem to only increase. Okay, at this time I'd like to jump down to the emergency housing. What I find is interesting is that Houston, or Harris County, has a population of 4.7 million. The greater Houston area, it's closer to 7 million, but there's only 330 shelter beds in Harris County compared to New York, which is twice the size, twice the population of Houston, but they have over 3,500 beds. So they're twice as large as us, but have 10 times the number of beds. So that's some evidence that we are not, I guess, competitive with other cities on making emergency shelters available, or emergency beds. Okay, now I'm going to jump down to the advocacy portion. Okay, this is not an exhaustive list, but there's things we can do to address the issue. Enforce local gun safety laws. Removing guns from abusers saves lives. Now remember, these are people, I understand there's a Second Amendment argument there, but a lot of these abusers, there's actually a legal finding, a court finding that they are guilty of family violence. So I do support the Second Amendment, but I do not think it applies to people who are abusers who have had their day in court, had an opportunity to present evidence as to why they're not an abuser, and the applicant in maybe a protective order or domestic violence case, they present their own evidence, and the judge, after hearing both arguments and looking at the evidence, has made a decision that they should not have weapons. Then I think it's fine. Something else we can do, increase safety for survivors. That would be through citywide domestic abuse response teams. Locate family violence support services. Ensure all survivors are provided an advocate at the 280th Protective Order Court. That would be a great solution. The 280th Protective Order Court is a district court in Harris County that hears domestic violence or protective orders. Something else we can do is fund safety on demand for survivors, address the turnaway numbers, for example, expand hotel access, educate our judges more on domestic violence, better job of arresting violators of protective orders, and support survivors. And of course, prosecute offenders. Working with local media. I know the local media in Houston, I know ABC 13 has been doing an excellent job partnering with the domestic violence advocates. and just education, information campaigns. So these are all, and then this is a 15-page report, a lot of great information here. I'd encourage you to take a look at it, but I don't want to turn this into a 1-hour video. Just kind of hit some of the high points that I feel are important. Well, anyways, I hope you got something good out of this video. I hope it raised some more awareness to protect victims. Please consider subscribing. Thank you.